Hello, this is Dr Helen and Welcome to our GenderGP podcast, where we will be discussing some of the issues affecting the trans and non-binary community in the world today, together with my co-host, Marianne Oakes, a trans woman herself, and our head of therapies. Hello, welcome to GenderGP podcast. Today I'm really happy to welcome Mia Violet, and as always I'm going to let Mia introduce herself, tell you a little bit about her and what she does and why we're really excited to talk to her today. Hi Mia.
Hello. Oh gosh, I never know how to introduce myself. It's like, how do you...
Put you on the spot.
Yeah, it's like, how do I... Because there's no real way to say I've written a book and not come across like you're just real arrogant, like, oh, I've written a book, by the way. I'm an author. It's like, this is really terrible, but like, I've got the book right here as well. So yeah, I'm a trans woman, an author. I wrote Yes You Are Trans Enough, which is like part memoir, part like primer on trans issues. I use Twitter a lot, more than I probably should, where I am at omia.god. I also use Instagram a bit, where I'm o.mia.god. I talk about trans issues and self-love.
So, Yes You Are Trans Enough is your book. So why did you feel the need to tell the world that, yes, you need to be trans enough to be anything? So tell us what...
Sure. Yeah, sure. So I was at an event recently and someone said, what was the emotion behind why you wrote the book? And I answered honestly and said, honestly, rage. Like anger, because what happened, the kind of genesis of the book is a really long story, so I won't bore everyone with it, but the short version is that I read an article by someone that quoted another trans woman. I can't remember who it was, and she said, she was talking about another trans woman, and she said, oh, she's not trans enough to like have gotten this title or this award or whatever. And on it, and like as a trans person, that really, really annoyed me, because I'm someone who's dealt with like, oh, am I trans enough feelings basically my entire life. So I wrote an article just off the top of my head where I was like, there's no such thing as trans enough. Like, yes, you are trans enough. You don't have to hit these stereotypes. You don't have to, have gone through these milestones. I was thinking a lot about the stereotypes. Like I always say, I don't fit into that. I always played with dolls as a child. I'm like, I always played with Batman as a child. Like I loved, superheroes and action-y things. But obviously I'm still female. So I wrote this article and kind of just like debunking things off the top of my head. And I just threw it out onto my blog, and I didn't really think anything was going to happen. I wrote it for me more than anything else, but I hoped that it would like click with like a couple of the people who are in a similar situation. And it kind of blew up a bit, which really surprised me. And then I realized, oh, lots of people struggle with this feeling. And then, yeah, short version of the story is publisher got in touch because they'd read some of my other writing and said, would you like to pitch a book? And I thought, well, the only book I really have like the fire to write right now is a book of the article, essentially saying, hey, let's do away with all the stereotypes. Let's talk about some realities. I've been trans for those of us who don't fit into these sort of expectations. Let's get rid of some myths. And also I can use my own story to illustrate that point. So that's how that happened. I honestly wasn't sure if anyone would read the book. I thought it might just fall flat. But it's gone down really well. People seem to really like it, which is I'm so grateful for. So yeah, that's my long rambling explanation of what my book is.
Have you had any feedback from the trans community at all, Mia?
Sure, yeah. The main thing I hear, which is always really lovely, is people saying that they recognise themselves in the book. People who read it and was like, oh, I felt like that as well. Oh, I did that. But the kind of tragic side of it is that they tell me that that's the first time they've actually come across that. Like, watching the documentaries and like, the coverage in the media, I think a lot of trans people have felt like they haven't been properly represented. So it's quite an honor, honestly, that some people have read my book and said, oh, I actually feel seen by this. I actually recognize my story in this, which was the main hope that I had in writing it, really, is that it would reach the people who are like me from a few years ago, and it would sort of tell them what they need to hear to just sort of feel a bit better about themselves.
Yeah, I think the thing that resonates with me, just hearing you talk, actually, is that I think we grow up isolated and we're trying to work out ourselves what's going on. And it's very easy to fall into a narrative of, well, you can't be trans because. And actually, despite all that, we just become more conflicted. So I think that idea of, yes, we're all trans enough wherever we are, really.
Exactly, yeah. Like, I have memories of when I was about like 18, 19, and I sort of like had friends of friends who were trans. And we'd like hang out together, and then afterwards I'd be like, I wish I was trans. Like, I wish I could do that, but I'm not, so I can't. So that obviously is ridiculous in hindsight. Like, only trans people want to transition. Only trans people want to be trans. But yeah, I think that is something that a lot of us have dealt with because of the way that the media have presented us. Because I was like, oh, well, I don't think my body is disgusting. I'm not incredibly depressed 24/7. So therefore I can't be trans. And I genuinely believed that for several years, and it really delayed my transition.
We're talking about the myth of dysphoria there, really. I mean, what is dysphoria? It's different things to different people. And yeah, there's a lot of people grow up and they are perfectly sane and rational, and this is just something that I feel I need to do, or whatever that might be. I think it is a myth that everybody has to be at a point of distress, which is something me and Helen talk about, I think, on a regular basis. Would you agree, Helen?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really interested in these milestones. I mean, Mia, you mentioned 2 milestones. I was going to ask you about the milestones, like what are these milestones? And you mentioned 2 just off the cuff, which was, one was the dysphoria, and the other one was, the hating the body, wasn't it? And then the depression. And I think, doctors or healthcare professionals, nurses, psychiatrists, psychologists, anybody in that kind of privileged position of having a judgment on a trans person who is looking for those tick box milestones. Did you feel this from an early age? No. Did you know you were trans when you were little? No. Did you really, really hate your body? No. Did you play with Barbie? No. Right. Well, in which case, sorry, mate, you're not trans enough. And, I'm cringing inside at the thought of it. But that's what's happening, isn't it? And I think this is a really important discussion to have. It's educate. I don't know what it's like to be trans enough, because I don't know. Marianne says we're all a little bit trans, and I really, really agree with that. But I've never wanted to transition, so how am I supposed to know? Who's going to teach me if it's not you guys? And I think that's really important.
I think you can really see that with the way that the NHS actually treats trans people. Like, I remember I arrived at the GIC and I was already on hormones. I'd had 2 doctors, one of them you, already basically say, yes, it seems pretty clear that you're trans. I arrived with letters saying that, and I still had to be assessed. And in the assessment, I was being asked, oh, what was it like growing up? Did you wear, girls' clothing? And I was there kind of like, I'm here, I'm on hormones, I'm fully out, I have been forever. Like, do you really think that you have to ask me questions about my childhood? Do you really think that's relevant right now? Like, do you really think you can be like, well, she's here in front of us, clearly presenting female, she's come out to everyone, her family, friends, she, works as female, but did she play with dolls?
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous. I was sat there and I was thinking to myself, I wanted to stand up and just be like, this is a farce. This is ridiculous. This is completely ridiculous. But instead, because obviously of the power that they have in the system, I just sat there and was kind of like, and just kind of had to nod through it. And it took me years and years and years to get through all these assessments. I mean, I'm still in the system now. I haven't had lower surgery, but it's like 5 years now since I initially went to the NHS for help. But yeah, I could go on a tangent probably.
I mean, you just gave us a few more milestones there, didn't you? You've come out to all your family, you've changed your clothes, you've changed your name. These are all, again, these tick box milestones, aren't they? And it's actually the one question you need to ask me is, excuse me, can I just ask you, are you a woman? You know what I mean? And that's
yeah.
That's it. Are you a woman who got the wrong hormones from birth? And should we switch you onto the right hormones? And, it just feels like that's the missing question, isn't it? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But then also really interesting, I was dying to ask you as you were talking so animatedly, I was dying to ask you, so did you put up with it? Did you you just answer all their questions? I'm thinking, I bet she did. And it is that power, isn't it? And again, it's such a privileged position for these people to be in, to ask those tick box questions, to test your milestones, to have the power to put you through a 5-year assessment process and not give you your hormones and not give you your surgery. It's...
Yeah, exactly. It's like when I was writing my book, like I was writing about, the GIC experience, and I was saying like how frustrating it was. And part of me was like, is this going to like come back and have consequences? Like, am I going to be in an appointment one day and the doctor's going to be like, did you write a book? But I thought to myself, and I was like, am I willing to risk my own sort of health pathway, whatever word they want to use, so that I can tell like the authentic truth? Yes, honestly, yes. I think if I'm going to put a book out, I have a responsibility to do it accurately and completely truthful and not hold anything back. So I thought, okay, I'm going to just do it. And if it has consequences, fine, I'll deal with it. But thankfully, it's not so far. So
I don't believe they'll read it. If I'm honest with you, I think the NHS clinicians, if I can say, are just so involved in their own model that they don't have the inclination to look beyond it. And that, to me, is what the problem is with the NHS service. And as is well documented, I'm under the care of the NHS, the same as you are. But the reality is, it is a farce. The question that they ask bears no relevance to our experience.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, I'm hoping though, Marianne, I'm going to pick you up on that. That, why do we do the work that we do? And the work that we do is to educate and inform. So let's not tar every single clinician in this field with the same brush, because there will be people who want to learn and want to adapt and want to change. And the protocols will one day be rewritten, even if they're rewritten slightly. They'll be rewritten, and it's information like this that we're sharing today. And Mia was brave enough to put it in a book. This is about taking those words from a book and putting them into a podcast. There's lots of different ways that people learn, and I think this is really important. That's why we do our work, isn't it? Really. But Mia, that fear of telling the truth. How can we be in a position where you're scared of telling the truth in case your healthcare is taken away from you? And we see that all the time. When we look on forums and things, it's like, right, I'm going to the doctor today. They're going to ask me some questions. Can someone tell me how to answer these questions? Because I'm scared I'm not going to get it right. Wow. Like, goodness gracious.
Yeah, I saw that. So I do a bit of volunteering with a trans youth group, and I was meeting with parents once, and they were talking. Some of them had experience with the NHS so far, and some of them were kind of on the waiting list, and there was a lot of anxiety in that room of like, what do we tell them, what do we say? And I was kind of like, I'm not saying lie, because you shouldn't really lie to your healthcare professionals, but at the same time, like, your kids know themselves, they know what they want, like, just stick to that. Like, don't let them derail things, don't let them get caught up in analysing other things. But it's just so depressing, isn't it? It's like these people are meant to be there to help, and instead they're seen almost as antagonists because there's just so much fear that they're not going to act honestly, they're not going to act based on common sense. It's just so depressing.
I get the feeling as well that parents feel judged when they go for, when it's trans youth healthcare. The parents go in there and they're frightened of how they're going to be perceived as parents.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I remember talking to the parents, and these are people who are just incredible. I talked to a woman once who was crying and saying that she feels she's not doing enough, and she's really worried that her daughter's going to grow up and is going to resent that she didn't try hard enough. And I just sat down with her and I was like, you have to realize you are incredible. Like, you're doing everything perfectly. There's nothing that you could do that you're not doing. I was like, your kid's going to grow up and look at you and be like, wow, like, I have the best mother in the universe. She, like, you know, really pushed and tried and helped me. And it does bother me, because I think that, like you're saying, yeah, the parents are worried that they're going to get judged. The parents are worried how it's going to reflect on them. But in actuality, the parents are doing incredible work. But I mean, that's the whole problem with the media, isn't it? There's this narrative that, oh, the parents are pushing the kids into it. And it's like, come on, who would do that? Like, who would actually want to put their kids through this stress? Nobody.
What's in it for the parent to do that?
Yeah, precisely. There's no benefit.
No. I think, and it's interesting, isn't it? Again, from a medical point of view, as I'm listening to you, it's how we split up. It's kind of like trans parents seem to have a different set of rule book or what have you from parents who are not a parent of a trans kid. And actually, it's the same. It's exactly the same. What should we do as parents? We should support our children. We should love our children. We should believe our children, and we should fight fearlessly for them, whatever it is that they're going through. And it's like, it's no different for parents who are trans and parents who've got, you know, trans youth that they're trying to support, love, believe, and act fearlessly for.
Of course, yeah.
You know, and they are brave, but their children are braver, I reckon. But they have that same checklist as well, don't they? And imagine being a parent who's struggling with understanding what it's like to have a child who's you know, displaying different gender, and then having to convince somebody else with that set of questions that we just talked about. You know, did they know from a very early age? Well, no, they didn't tell me till they were 13. Not trans enough. Oh no.
Yeah. I do come across a lot where they, you know, oblivious to it, but actually when they start talking, there were signs there. And it's interesting. It's just getting people to realise that inconsequential, you know, events, when you don't know about a child's gender identity, seem like nothing. But when you start looking back, you think, actually, there probably was a few signs there. But none of it proves anything. You know,
of course.
It's, like you say, you like to play with Batman. What did that prove? Are girls not allowed to play with Batman?
Exactly, yeah, because it's like we've got one set of standards for cisgender kids and then one set of standards for, like, trans kids. I remember that, like, that court case a couple of years ago where it was like, oh, the judge ruled that the kid couldn't actually be a trans girl because she liked playing with superheroes. It's like, okay, so if we get a cisgender girl and she likes playing with superheroes, and we're like, oh, okay, you must be a boy, sorry. Like, it's just absolutely ridiculous. But like what you're saying as well about, like, there being signs and you not really realising at the time, I think that sort of happened with me, and especially with my own mother. When I came out to her the first time, when I was a teenager, she sort of said, oh, well, I can think of all these memories where you were kind of, you know, acting like a boy. That's I'm using air quotes for anyone who's not watching. And at the time as a kid, I was like, oh, okay, that sounds valid. But obviously it's not. But now as an adult, when I was sitting down to write my book, I was like, okay, let's actually think about my childhood. And like I say, I talk about the Batman stuff and I play that up to prove a point. But also I thought about it and I was like, well, I was super sensitive. I was very emotional. I was crying all the time. Like, I preferred to hang out with girls at school and just chat. I didn't like playing sports. So it's like, if you want to talk stereotypes, there were signs that were there, but at the same time, there shouldn't need to be signs.
No.
Like, because there was other things as well. I talk about in the book that there was a time when I was watching a film, I think it was called A Little Princess, and the film made me cry. I was so invested in it. And I was like, oh, like, I cannot let my dad see me crying or see me enjoying this film. So I like pretended to be asleep. And then when he came downstairs and the film was on, I was like, oh, I fell asleep. Because I was like performing. I was performing masculinity because I knew that's what I had to do. So if you look at it from like my dad's point of view, he could say, oh, well, you know, there were no signs. And it's like, yeah, because I hid them. Because even at a very, very young age, children are aware of how they're supposed to act or not supposed to act. And they will adapt to that. Like, I remember being at school and like boys as young as like 6 and 7, like laughing at other boys who did, again, I'm doing air quotes, like girly things. And I think that hasn't come naturally to them. That's taught behavior. Someone in their family, someone in their life has taught them, boys act like this, girls act like this. And if any of them cross over, then you make fun of them, which obviously is horrible. But yeah, so I've gone on a tangent, but you see what I mean. Like,
I think I've spoke to Helen on many occasions about some of the information gathering sessions we do. And I sit there with a young girl and I'm asking them questions and I just want to write across the form, for God's sakes, help.
Yeah.
This is a girl. Why would I ask her these questions? Why are they even relevant? Sure. But I also understand that I think sometimes parents just need to know somebody is taking an interest and a vested interest. But there's sometimes you're just thinking, this is a young girl. What are the young girls ever going to have to talk about a childhood in this way?
Exactly.
And what relevance does it have to the girl that they are? So it's a difficult one.
Yeah.
I always quote this one, but when I was working a few years ago, I had a young trans boy with me in my clinic, and I said, "How do you know you're a boy? You know, your mum's struggling with this. How do you know you're a boy?" And he said, "Dr. Weberly, how do you know you're a girl?" And I'm like, "Oh, you know," and I was like, "Yeah, you're right. You know,
yeah, perfect.
I love all the people that taught me what I know. I really do. Mia, can we move on to the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about, if you don't mind, which was
of course.
the other thing that you've written, which I'm really interested in, and that's the law. Because when we made all these laws, we didn't really expect that people would switch gender, and so you know, these are really old-fashioned laws, and we've seen in the news about, you know, being a mum or a dad on birth certificates. And obviously your experience about being a wife or a husband. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, yeah. So I'm engaged and have been for about a year and a half now. But when we got engaged, there was kind of this spectre hanging over it, where I was thinking, well, I don't have a gender recognition certificate. So if I get married during the ceremony, I'll be called a husband, and on the marriage certificate I'll be a husband, which is obviously ridiculous, but also like that was really demoralizing. And at the time I thought, okay, I'm not doing that. I'm not willing to do that. That's dehumanizing. I resent that that's the system that's in place, so I'm just not going to get married until the law changes. So I'm not married, and that's quite demoralizing. And what I found at first, I felt pressured to sort of not say this. So I'd be talking to friends, you know, like cisgender friends, and they'd be like, "Oh, have you got a date yet?" And I'd be like, "Oh no, you know, we're just saving money." Or like, "Oh, we don't have the money," you know. But in the back of my mind, I was like, that's not the real reason. The real reason is because of the way that my gender would be presented. I'm just not willing to do that. And then after a while I thought, why am I hiding this? Because it's not something I should be ashamed of or embarrassed of. I haven't created this rule. Like, the rules are ridiculous. I have to live by them, but I shouldn't accept responsibility for them. Mm. So I wrote that article and said, this is my situation. This is why we need self-identification. And I was surprised how many people messaged me and said, I had no idea that was the case, no idea at all. A lot of people were very upset and very annoyed. And unfortunately, there were a couple of trans people who have wedding dates who messaged me and said, I didn't actually know this. And so they said, like, thank you for giving me a heads up. And I just said, like, I feel horrible for like being the bearer of such bad news. But I mean, I guess at least I got a heads up of what was coming, because that must have been a horrible surprise.
So is it like, does it matter whether it's a religious wedding or a civil ceremony? Are they the words you have to use? I take you as my lawful wedded husband.
I believe so, yeah. I believe that because by law, when you get married, it uses birth certificate. So basically it goes by what is on the birth certificate. So if your birth certificate says male, which mine does, which is wrong, then that's what is used in the ceremony. And therefore, if I got married, I'd be classed as a husband, which again is obviously ridiculous. But it's because, of course, the only way at the moment to change birth certificate is gender recognition certificate, which I am honestly quite morally opposed to its existence, because I think it's dehumanizing. It's a trans tax because it costs us money. It's a panel of people that sit and look at evidence and decide what gender you are, which is just like ridiculous. Can you imagine that in like day-to-day life with cis people? If people were like, oh, I'm a man, and then they were like, oh, okay, well, can you send us some evidence and I'll get together with some people and we'll think about it and we'll let you know if you are or if you're not. Like, it's completely ridiculous, but that is how it works for trans people.
The challenge I've put in to all of that is, if they deem that you're not, where does that leave that individual?
Yeah,
precisely.
Do you know what I mean? So, okay, so you've decided I'm not, so I know I'm not a guy, so where does that leave me? Yeah. Do I no longer exist? Do you know what I mean? That's the farce of it, really.
Yeah.
And the other point I wanted to pick up on, which it shocks me a little bit because I've never tried. I was already married and I've never had to think about it. However, I'm really disappointed that that they can't be flexible in how they manage ceremonies and the paperwork. That why do we need a gender recognition certificate or a birth certificate to be recognised for who we feel we are? Why should anybody have to take a title on that they don't feel suits them and that bears no relevance to their place in life or society?
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't make any sense. I think where we are as a society and a culture now, it doesn't have a reason to exist. Everything should just be self-identifying. It's not going to harm anyone if we bring that in. It's very demoralizing.
I remember when I was studying medical law, and there was a case that we were studying, and it's about how you interpret the law. And so there was a case that we studied where the law says if you are mending the railway tracks and something happens to you, your wife or your partner will get compensation. So there was this guy, but he wasn't mending the tracks. He was just doing general upkeep of the tracks, and he got run over by a train and died. And his wife was claiming that benefit. But the law said it was because you only got that if you mended the tracks, not if you were upkeeping the tracks. And so the wife didn't get the benefit. And so it goes back to, although what we're talking about is at a social level and what we understand should happen and what is right, if the law says that if you have male on your birth certificate, you have to be called husband, that's written in the law. So, and it's really hard, isn't it? Because how can we, people like us, challenge what's written down in that really technical language on those, in those law conventions or whatever they are, But we've got to, haven't we? We've got to kind of stand proud and say, the law needs to be rewritten. You need to rewrite it because you got it wrong. It's not your fault you got it wrong. You wrote it in the best at the time. You wrote it in the best interests of everybody. But sorry, you made a mistake, and we need to rewrite that now. And it's about having those people who have got time and investment to do that, but it needs to be done, doesn't it? And I so agree with you on the self-identification bit. And that's what I guess we've been talking about this morning, isn't it, really? This is me, believe me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's also like, like the example you just used then, that's an obvious example of where the intent of the law was one thing, but due to like syntax and the exact wording that they've used, then it's stuck in another way. And I feel that that's sort of what you see going on with all the equality stuff, where you look at like the trans protections and it's like, okay, what is gender reassignment? Like, what actually is that if we talk about it? And I think, yeah, going forward, just in general, when it comes to trans rights and the law again and trans people, we need to be really clear in the language. So there's no room for kind of interpreting it in different ways. Because, I mean, what I'm kind of dancing around is like a lot of people think it means surgery, but obviously surgery is not available to everyone. It's not what everybody wants. So I think we definitely, as a culture, need to move away from the idea of like transition is a pathway and it ends in surgery, because it doesn't for a lot of people.
Again, it's those milestones, isn't it? You're not trans enough if you don't go all the way, and it's like
exactly.
Of course you are, you know, and what different people have different needs, don't they? And I was just thinking when you talking before, you know, please can we have some trans people on the panel when they rewrite the law? Can we make sure we get the language right and not have a bunch of cis people going, I think this is probably what we should write. You know, let's have some people who actually understand it.
Yeah, it reminds me when I was at work, I know I keep saying this, but I mentioned it in the book, but I was in an equalities meeting at work when I just got my new job, and I had looked at the trans policy, and it was really bad. Like, it was full of really old language, and I looked at it, and as a trans person, I was like, no trans person, like, touched this. No trans person proofread this, looked at it, was involved. I can just tell. So at the equalities meeting, they said, oh, okay, does anyone have any other like comments or anything, you know, about the equalities in our company? And I was just like, the trans policy stinks. It's just terrible. And I was like, I'm willing to help rewrite it, but at the moment it's terrible. And to their credit, they did get in touch, and I sat down and we wrote a new policy. And the final policy that we ended up writing was like a quarter of the length of the original one, because there was just so much fluff and so much like all these details. And I was like, you don't need any of that. It's just like, you know, self-identify, transition is, you know, on the person's own timeline, because it was all bizarre timeline stuff in the original one. It's like, well, this week you'll come out, and then this week you'll go away, and then in this week you'll come back. And I was just like, why? Who's this benefiting? So yeah, I agree. Like, we need to involve trans people because we understand, obviously, from our lived experience how it should be done. And I think a lot of the times, and as you were saying before, I think sometimes it's well-meaning. I always say I have no ill will towards these people who are like, we are trying to help, we just kind of don't get it. I definitely think there's a difference between writing these things and trying to sort of restrict people's rights, and writing them and thinking, I think this is what people want. I think if we just kind of gently educate and be like, okay, this needs changing, then that's kind of the way forward.
And from my understanding as well, there are charities that will go around and help companies. You know, maybe these, you know, companies try to do it to be politically correct, pay lip service, and actually get it wrong.
Sure.
But, you know, bringing in people, trans people with lived experience, and actually talking to other companies that have gone through it as well. Because it's the same with the schools, the amount of young kids that they're coming out at school, and the schools kind of go into a bit of a meltdown about it and try to either overcompensate or get irritated at the child because of the problems it's causing the individuals having to sort this. But I'm sure there's plenty of help out there.
Yeah, because I mean, we've got a situation where we just have such drastically different levels of support in schools, don't we? I'm thinking again about volunteering and talking to parents. I remember hearing from one parent who was having just such an exhausting, horrible time trying to just get some support for their kids. And then, for instance, I was at an event not so long ago, and I was talking to a trans teenager, and I was like, how's school going? It's just like an adult thing to do. How's school? But I meant, like, you know, you're transitioning. How is the school taking? Are they supporting you? And she was just like, yeah, it's fine. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, everyone's taking it well. Teachers are protecting you. And she was like, yeah, it's fine. It's not a problem. And I was just like so delighted. And I was like, oh, cool. But like I was surprised because I've just said so many horror stories. So I mean, it's nice to know some places are getting it right, but it's just such a dice roll at the moment.
Well, I guess she's not trans enough. You know, if school wasn't horrific for her getting bullied, then she's not trans enough.
Yeah, of course.
I just. But sorry, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, because I think, you know, people like you, Marianne, people like you, Mia, have got the strength to stand up, to write, to say, to speak, to show people that, you know, that the way the future is going to be better for trans people and more inclusive and right. And you know, when you talked about that policy in your workplace, that you volunteered to help rewrite it for the good. But I'm sometimes scared for, you know, these situations where, oh, you're trans, therefore you must lead the way on this project because you're trans and you must educate us. And people are like, whoa, I'm not ready in my life to do this. You know, I'm struggling with my own place and I'm not ready. And I think, you know, we've got to be really careful, haven't we, that this is a voluntary thing rather than just because you're trans, you have to take that really responsible position.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, like, what I try and say on social media a lot is I say, like, when you come out as trans, it's kind of up to you what you do next. Like, we don't show up and be like, welcome, you've been conscripted into the trans army. These are your responsibilities. You'll be deployed over here. It's like, because I've talked to a lot of people, whenever I do like Q&A events, a lot of the times one of the themes that comes up is people are like, I feel bad because I'm not doing enough. I'm not helping enough. I'm not enough of an activist. And I say, like, you're allowed to just live. Like, if you want to do activism, you want to help out, awesome. But like, not everyone is built to like be on the front lines. Some of us just, you know, are people who are going to support those around us. Some of us have got a lot going on in our lives and we just need to look after ourselves, and that's fine. And I'm thinking that's, related to like the workplace stuff. Exactly. It's like, just because you're trans, it doesn't mean you want to become this ambassador. As well, like I always try and say, like, I'm just one trans person. That's it. I don't speak for trans people. I don't understand all of the trans experiences. Everything I do is just from me. And I really think more people need to understand that. Like, if I show up to an event, I'm talking as Mia Violet. I'm not talking as a trans woman who is representing the community and explaining all the truths, because none of us can do that. So I really wish organizations would kind of understand, like, if we've got a trans person here, maybe we can ask if they want to help, but also we need to reach out as well. It kind of frustrates me a little bit because the company I work for, I wish they would reach out to the community more, and I wish they would kind of get a wider collection of opinions and thoughts when they're doing things like crafting the trans policy. But unfortunately, I think a lot of the time people are just like, well, a trans person looked at it and ticked it, so it's fine. It's fine.
All I was going to follow up with is to kind of support what you're saying, Mia, as well. That I think a lot of people, when they come out, the last thing they want to do is be stood in front of everybody talking about it.
Sure.
They almost, the biggest fear of a lot of trans people coming out that I've experienced is, I don't want a fanfare. I don't want a spotlight. I just want to actually integrate in quietly, get on with my job, be respected for what I do, not who I am, and actually these fireworks go off, and before you know it, they'll say, right, you can stand in front of the HR team and explain all the problems that you're going to have. Well,
sure,
the first one's here. I don't want to do it.
I mean, I also feel like, sorry, I'm very coffee this morning. I'm not used to talking this much this early in the morning. I was just thinking about, like, because there are like certain areas of my life where I don't mind standing up and being like, I'm trans, let's talk about it. Because like in my job, I work on like a front desk. So I'm totally fine with being like, I'm a trans person when I'm at that job, because I kind of like that when other trans people come in, I can be like, oh, hey, hi, you're safe, it's cool, I've got you. But there's other areas of my life where, like, if I'm meeting new friends, I'm just like, I can't really be bothered talking about it. Like, because I was thinking, I went to an LGBT social group recently. Lovely people, not not knocking the people or anything, but we were there and I mentioned like, oh yeah, I'm trans, but like can't really be bothered talking about it a lot of the time. And someone there was like, oh, so what is it like being a trans woman and living where you live? And I was just like, do we have to? Like, really? Like, I'm here just to chat about whatever. Like, I am a person beyond a trans person. I think that is kind of a bit of a frustration just in everyday life in general. I do worry sometimes that I walk in and people just see like trans, like as I walk in as the very first thing. It's like, I do like other things. I do other things. Like, I am more than that. But yeah, I assume that's a problem that will solve itself as time goes on and kind of as people become more used to the idea that trans people are everywhere. For instance, don't want to go on a tangent, but just quickly, I taught for International Women's Day this month, and I was talking to the organizer afterwards, and she was saying, oh, it was really good. A lot of people came up and said, oh, that's the first time I've ever seen a trans person. And I was just like, no, it's not. Like, you think it is. It's the first time a trans person was in front of you and said, I am trans. It's not the first time. For starters, there were at least 2 other trans people in the room, in the audience. So I can tell you, I wasn't even the first trans person you'd seen that day. But yeah, that's where we are culturally, I guess.
I suppose the hope is actually, because we talk about trans rights, and I think one of the frustrations I have is that we have to have specific rights just to exist. And I think the more visible we become, the less talk. I think they'll always be there, but the less they'll be verbalised. That actually in our birth certificate will just be something we do, like applying for a passport or any other kind of documentation that we do. And that's hopefully the other generations coming through, because again, as people know, that's my passion really, is that it isn't about me now. My time's gone. It's about the people following through that they're able to just live a life where being trans doesn't define them, where they're not the first trans person to have been at that school or in that job. And that actually it'll just become another part of ordinary life.
Yeah, exactly. Like I always say, I'm very grateful for the people, who've come before me and my generation and have made things so much easier for me. And I feel like there's a responsibility as a whole, not as individuals, but like as a whole, for our generation to make sure that the next generation have it just as easier as we can make it, and just leave it just better than we found it. Because like, we need to make it better for ourselves, sure, but yeah, the main focus for me has always been, let's just make sure that the kids coming out now have a better time.
I think one of the issues, probably at the risk of upsetting potentially 1 or 2 listeners, is I think sometimes a lot of the activism is done by older people of my generation, and the reality is what we grew up through isn't relevant now. And I think sometimes even some of the people I know, some friends of mine, and I apologise, but they're sometimes not understanding that, no, it's different now. That what we need to be fighting for is what's relevant now. And I think at GenderGP, correct me if I'm wrong, Helen, but, when we started, there was a lot of people, shall we say, 40 plus.
Yeah.
And now it's 25 and under a lot. Yeah. And that's in a few short years. So arguing, we want everybody's rights included, but the road forward is for the next 13, 14, 15-year-olds to be comfortable, to get a good education, to go on and have careers and fulfilling relationships without the dogma of certificates and boards of people that they never even get to meet.
Yeah, I honestly think that's a great point. It sounds so arrogant to keep I was at this event and, I was doing speaking because I'm so important. But I was asked a question when I was being interviewed last month, and someone said, so if someone said, do you want to write like a guidebook for like trans teenagers, would you do it? And I said, no, I wouldn't do it. And they were like, oh, why not? And I said, well, because I'm not a trans teenager. Like, I was one, but I'm not now. Like, what is it like coming out right now? What is it like being a trans teenager right now? I don't know. My advice would be based on, 15-year-old experiences, which is just not relevant. And I'm very kind of aware of this, and I think all of us activists need to be aware of this as well, that like when we transition and when we come out, it's like, okay, those are our experiences in that time, and time moves very, very quickly when it comes to this stuff. So I think we always need to like listen to the younger generation. We need to make sure we're not always boosting the same voices over and over again. We need to introduce new people. We need to talk to new people, because if it's just us, the same people talking again and again and again, our experiences are going to become less and less and less relevant. And then the people who need help right now, who are coming out, they're not going to be able to relate to us. And at that point, why are we even doing it? I am worried about this, and I do try and think about it for myself as well. Like I said on Twitter not so long ago, I was like, I think there should sort of be a sell-by date when it comes to like standing on a platform being like, I'm speaking for trans people, and I include myself in this. Like 5 years ago that I asked for help transitioning, I'm like, it's quite a while ago now. And I think there is going to be a point where I have to be like, okay, I can talk about my experiences of what it's like being a trans person right now, living as trans. And I can talk about how it felt when I was a kid back then, but I can't talk about what it's like coming out right now, because I simply do not know. It is not relevant anymore.
But it's what's relevant is your next hurdle, which is being a wife on your marriage certificate.
Sure, yeah.
There are still challenges ahead for you, I'm sure. That are going to be, because someone like you, an activist like you, is going to be so useful for the rest of your life, whether you talk about or
I feel like I'll be here as long as people want me to be here.
Do it. Don't go. We still need you.
Okay.
I remember Fierce Mum on Twitter. She just going back to talking about those certificates that we need, and she said, "I need to correct my daughter's birth certificate." And I loved that image, that it's not her fault. It's not that family's fault that someone wrote it wrong. Someone wrote son, and it's not. It's daughter. And I love that concept of correcting these things. Your birth certificate needs to be corrected. It's wrong. You don't want to be in a position where you get married now, and then not only have we got to correct your birth certificate in 5 years' time, we've got to correct your marriage certificate as well. Let's get it right this time.
Yeah, exactly. This is a great way to put it. Like, it makes the most sense. Like, why would we go forward with documents that we know are wrong? Like, let's just change the law so we can make it easy to correct them. Why would we not do that?
Yeah. I think, Marianne, you talked about trans rights. Trans rights are just the same as every other human right, aren't they? And I think, the three of us today talking about advocacy and how, I'm in a kind of a position as a healthcare professional where I will be able to have influence on policies and things like that. And it's really important that activists like you teach policymakers like me, I guess, how to get this right. And I it's so interesting. Every single time we talk to somebody new, something else comes up. I'm like, I hadn't thought of that. It's really, really important to have these discussions. I hope that our listeners today have found it as amazing and informing as I have. And thank you so much, Mia, for joining us today. And
that's okay. Thank you for inviting me. It's been fun. I mean, I always enjoy any excuse to just chat.
Let me know. I want to come to your next event. Don't stop doing events. And if anybody wants to have a look at Mia's book, we'll put a link at the bottom of the podcast so that anyone can have a look, because it sounds like I haven't read it but it sounds like it's going to be a very good read. I'm sure you'll join me, Marianne, in thanking Mia today.
It's been great, Mia. Thank you for coming and joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you. We hope you've enjoyed our programme. Do go ahead and subscribe if you haven't done so already. If you or anyone else are affected by any of the topics discussed in our podcast and you'd like to contact us, please drop us a line at doctor@gendergp.co.uk. We're very happy to accept ideas for future episodes and guests, or if there's something specific you'd like us to cover. You can also visit our website, www.gendergp.co.uk. You can follow us on social media @GenderGP, and you can sign up to our monthly newsletter. Full details can be found in the show notes on our podcast page. Thanks for listening.